Today, a wave of attacks, a minister killed, and a capital under siege.
We have surrounded Bamako. No trucks, cars, or even animal-drawn carts will be allowed to enter the city.
What's behind the recent surge of violence in Mali? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Hey everyone. If this is your first time catching an episode of The Take, stick around. There is much more like this in the pipeline. And if you're a tried and true viewer or listener of the podcast, we're really glad you're here. Either way, we want to hear from you. Let us know what types of stories you want us to cover more of and what angles you think we should explore. Use the comment section to leave your thoughts or reach out on social media. We're at AJE Podcasts, and I'm at Bilal. Now, here's today's show. On the morning of April 25th, 2026, people in Bamako woke up to explosions.
Mali's army says armed groups launched surprise assaults targeting key military positions in Bamako and other regions. The military government...
By the end of that day, Mali's defense minister had been killed alongside his wife and children when a suicide bomber drove a car into their home.
During the intense fighting, he was wounded and then transported to the hospital, where he unfortunately succumbed to his injuries.
Où il a malheureusement succombé. En outre,
fighters were in the streets of cities across one of West Africa's largest countries. Two historically opposing groups, the al-Qaeda-linked Jenim and separatist Tuareg rebels, had launched a series of coordinated attacks against the military government.
In what analysts and diplomats described as one of the largest coordinated attacks in the country in recent years, Mali's army said in a statement it had killed, quote, several hundred assailants and repelled the assault.
But before a single shot was fired, more than 5 million people in Mali were already in humanitarian need. To understand what's unfolding in Mali, I spoke to someone who's been following it all closely.
I'm Beverly Ochieng. I'm a senior analyst. I work with control risks, doing political analysis, looking at the Francophone region, and I'm based in Senegal, in Dakar.
Well, Beverly, it's good to have you back on The Take. Welcome.
Thank you.
As you mentioned, you consult organizations that work in the broader Sahel region, which has been really unstable for years now, to the point where it's been dubbed the coup belt. And today, we're going to zoom in on Mali. Mali has been in crisis for more than a decade, but last Saturday, it made international headlines again. What were you hearing from people you know in Mali?
So I woke up on Saturday to a flurry of WhatsApp messages, both from people who I have previously worked with, who are based in Bamako, the capital, but also from people who would be sharing information with us on what is going on at any given time. It was very chaotic. At first, it was about the fact that there had been some attacks being carried out by militant groups. One of my friends was actually moving out of their house on that particular day, and I asked him if he was okay, if he thinks he'll be able to move, and he was quite, this is just how things might be, so he will try get his things together. And then, obviously, within our own network here in Senegal, many of us are always following the situation in Mali and in the wider Sahel region. So we were texting each other to see if we have checked in on people that we know who were aware that there had been simultaneous attacks in various parts of the country. And before that attack took place, or this incident took place, there had been some warning signs that things had been building up. And sometimes you kind of adapt to certain risks because you've been watching something happening for a very long time. But of course, there's always the disruption to people's lives.
Okay, so the signs were there, but that doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that you knew that this was going to happen, that the defense minister was going to be killed. So walk us through, if you could, what actually went down once you got clarity between the flurry of WhatsApp messages from people in Mali.
Well, yeah, so on Saturday, there are two groups that launched simultaneous attacks in different parts of Mali. So that is in Bamako, near the airport, where the airbase is, in the military headquarters in Kati, which is about 15 kilometers north, in the central town of Sevare, where there is a large military base. And then there are two key towns in the northern region, Kidal and Gao. The groups involved were al-Qaeda's Jenim outfit, it is the Sahel branch, and the Azawad Liberation Front, which which is a separatist movement based in the north. They carried out simultaneous attacks against military and security forces. And then eventually it emerged that there had been a suicide car bomb that was driven at the home of the defense minister, which led to his death. There was uncertainty about the whereabouts of the interim president, Assimi Goïta, and also his intelligence chief, who had eventually been injured in these attacks. The news coming out was quite unclear. The government did issue several statements, one to reassure the public that they were actively fighting against the groups that had attacked them, another to just call for calm and for people not to panic.
The Malian army has said the situation is under control and urged citizens to remain calm. Cleanup operations were underway, it said, adding that several attackers had been neutralized.
Okay, so to make sure I have this right, the two groups who carried out these attacks together should, by most measures, be enemies because it sounds like they have two very different aims. Jenim is the al-Qaeda affiliate whose stated goal is to impose its interpretation of Islamic law across Mali. The Azawad Liberation Front, which is also known as the FLA, is this Tuareg separatist movement that describes itself as secular and Republican. They have fought each other in the past, but they've also coordinated before. And you're saying they're doing it again, or at least they did it again during these attacks. Why did they coordinate in these attacks? And why is the government their common enemy?
Well, yes. I mean, as you pointed it out, the government is their common enemy. For Jenim, the militant group, they have constantly challenged successive governments in Mali ever since they formed in 2017. It's an offshoot of 4 different groups that had been based in northern and central Mali. So they're able to draw support and recruit from these 2 regions. For the FLA, it has had a long-standing call for the independence of the northern region. This softened towards calling for autonomy, representation in the northern parts of the country. When the military government came into power, so first seizing power in 2020 in a coup, and then again in 2021, initially their plan had been to implement a peace agreement that had been signed between the FLA as it had been formed before and the government. Part of it was for fighters in the separatist group to move into the military ranks. But as there were divisions over how this deal would be implemented, the government decided that they will do away with it. And so confrontations began again. Now, these confrontations meant that there were a new flashpoint of violence. The government was not just fighting against Jenim, but now also fighting against the FLA. Over time, it did seem as if there was some loose coordination between the FLA and Jenim, especially when the government was moving towards the north. There was one particular incident in 2024 which seemed to suggest strong lines of coordination where Jenim and the FLA separately claimed a massive attack against Russian paramilitaries in Kidal in Tinzawa 10. And then afterwards, in 2025, it seemed as if they were formalizing a form of cooperation to oppose the government. And they do need each other in some ways tactically, because, of course, Jenim entirely on its own would not be able to take on the government. The FLA on its own is not able to take on the government. But if they can coordinate logistically, military support, even not necessarily ideologically, but in terms of their opposition to the government, then that gives them more leeway to then fight against this military government, which is what we now saw culminating this past weekend.
Oh, wow. It's complicated, but you broke that down so well that it makes sense what we have just seen take place. But you mentioned a country that some might be wondering, what is Russia doing here? And we should talk about it because one of the countries currently right now calling for stability in Mali is Russia. Russia has had a presence in the country since the military government expelled France and the United Nations from Mali after that first coup. And there was real support for this taking place in Mali.
Thousands of people rallied in Bamako on Wednesday to voice support for Mali's army rulers. The protesters chanted slogans denouncing former colonial ruler France, while some were seen waving Russian flags.
People were exhausted by over a decade of French intervention that had left them less safe. The military called on Russia to help fill this gap. Based on what we're seeing, though, how would you describe Russia's role in this? Is it doing what it was intended to do?
I mean, not so far. Russia came in at a point where they presented themselves as being able to plug in a gap that had been there when the UN and the French were asked to leave the country.
But Russia's presence in the country actually stretches back to 2021. The newly installed junta turned its back on long-standing strategic alliances with former colonial power France and sought new partnerships. And the Russian mercenary group Wagner stepped in, presenting itself as a solution to the country's security woes.
But it hasn't been the case. There were 2,000 forces who were deployed into the country compared with 20,000 UN and French forces and other European forces. That's a really big gap. Initially, they were focused on the central regions of Mali, trying to dislodge militants. They progressively moved to the north, but that left a cover gap in the south, which is where it is economically important for Mali. There are mining operations there. This is where most of the exports coming into Bamako would be going into to serve the rest of the country. When this gap emerged, it allowed Janim to be able to tilt towards this region. So as the army and Russia were focusing on the north, Janim was able to start making inroads further into other parts of the country, which it hadn't been the case before. Now, the Russian paramilitaries are interesting. When they came in as the Wagner group in late 2021, they had been accused of being very heavy-handed in their tactics. You know, there were allegations of human rights abuses. The Malian government did deny this. They said that they are working with Russian instructors to train the military forces. They now modified into what is called the Africa Corps, which is directly under the interim president, Assimi Goïta. They've become more risk averse. They often apparently need guarantees before they can be deployed to high risk zones. And so this past weekend, one of the most, I suppose, devastating aspects of that counterinsurgency with the Russians was that they easily ceded ground in Kidal. Now, it shows you that Russia is quite flexible. Ultimately, I think that whichever party prevails, whether it's the military government, whether it's the armed groups, Russia would fold itself to suit its operations there as long as it still has its own interests in place.
Oh, man. You know, Beverly, you said they easily ceded ground. There are videos of this happening that we can see that are circulating online over the weekend of the Russian mercenaries leaving that northern town, Kidal, that they had held since 2023, and they were granted safe passage in exchange for handing their weapons to the fighters.
Russian mercenaries, once feared and portrayed as powerful, driven out after surrendering their weapons to local Tuareg rebels and armed groups linked to al-Qaeda. Watching, the Tuaregs wave the flag of Azawad, the homeland they want to create in northern Mali.
Have you seen those videos? What do you make of them?
Yes, I did see the videos. I mean, the first thought for me was this is self-preservation because they would, as I said, they're very risk averse. They do not want to be engaged in all-out confrontations with the armed groups. They're not real stakeholders in the Malian conflict, if you think about it. These are Malian groups, Malian individuals. Russia can willingly step away and leave it to them and leave this war for them to try to either reconcile, negotiate, or fight. So in this case, it was an issue of flight. But it tells you a lot about the kind of broader strategy we're likely to see with Russia. There might be some thinking around maybe Russia is not the only answer to this insurgency.
You know, Beverly, as you're talking, I'm just thinking none of this sounds safe. None of this sounds good for the civilians, the everyday people, the people like your friend who's in the middle of a move when all of this went down. So I want to talk about who is supposed to be keeping them safe, because the current military government came into power, as you mentioned, in a couple of coups starting in 2020 and then 2021. And their entire justification for seizing power and then delaying elections has been security, protecting people from armed groups. But as a part of that protection, human rights organizations say that in the last few years, government forces in Mali have killed up to twice as many civilians than the groups they claim to be fighting, something that the government has previously denied. So how has the military government actually been delivering on the promise of security?
I mean, that's been challenging for the government, certainly, partly because being able to build the capacity of the army, being able to acquire enough equipment, being able to recruit, being able to deploy, has been constrained by various issues, key among them financial factors and a limitation of partners. By getting rid of the Western coalition and forces, whether it was France, whether it was the UN, it meant that there was a bit of a deficit. And it was an acrimonious handover. It had been planned for a long time, but the circumstances under which it happened made it quite difficult for there to be a clear handover so that these armies are ready to take on defense for their own people. In the long run, civilians will likely be caught in the crossfire. What is interesting about the latest pattern of violence, in particular by the al-Qaeda group Janim, is they have overtly asked civilians to stay away.
Abu Hudayfi al-Bambari, an al-Qaeda-linked commander speaking in Bambara, issues a stark warning to residents. He says he's not here to fight civilians, but Malian forces. Anyone who wants to leave can take their belongings and go.
But it's very difficult for you to stay away when you're caught between forces that are trying to fight against militants and armed groups or militant groups that are also targeting you if they perceive you to be working with the government. And then there's also the fear of reprisals, right? Part of the reason why the insurgency in Mali and across the Sahel has been extremely difficult is it does lead to tensions between communities that would ideally coexist. But because of their alignment, it then puts them in crossfire with one another.
Well, staying with the people, we know that the overall humanitarian need in Mali is really astounding. The United Nations puts the number of people in need at around 5 million people.
There'll definitely be more pressure, humanitarian pressure, especially if people do find themselves being displaced by subsequent incidents of violence taking place. And this is particularly like the central region where displacements have been quite frequent as a result of the continuous fighting between the military and with the militant groups. And in a world where now we're seeing humanitarian aid in and of itself is changing, whereby governments are not making, especially Western governments, are reducing their contributions, the pressure goes back down to the government. For the Malian government, their big priority has been spending on defense. So social issues such as health, education sometimes may fall on the wayside. And it's interesting also because these are the dynamics that either feed back into violence because then people are marginalized and not able to get sustenance, do not have socioeconomic opportunities. And this is another thing that militant groups like Janim then use to capitalize, to recruit people into their ranks because they then pledge beyond just their ideology. They offer payments, they offer certain benefits. So it feeds into a whole cycle of violence in and of itself.
Well, Beverly, it also begs the question, where is that money coming from? And so I want to tackle that for a bit if we can, because the Prime Minister of Mali, Abdoulaye Maïga, went to visit the injured and he condemned these attacks. And he also said in this statement that it's clear without the support of sponsors, these attacks couldn't have been carried out.
Il est évident que sans l'appui des sponsors, ces actes lâches et barbares n'auraient jamais pu se réaliser.
And I bring this up because there is this claim that's circulating on social media right now, picked up by Russian state media. It boils down to this. France had a hand in these attacks. French intelligence was somehow involved in planning or enabling them. Of course, we cannot independently verify those claims that are circulating on social media, as I said. But what does the evidence actually show about where that financing could be coming from?
I mean, it's very complex, and a lot of it is both circumstantial and also just the way that these groups operate. And I think Janim has it's a very opaque but robust financial model. Beyond, again, ideology, they are economic stakeholders in certain places. So gold mines in the northern parts of the country, they oversee security there, so they are able to get concessions and they're able to trade that in the legal markets. They do have active ways of generating income. These allegations are tied to some of the perceived links between France in particular and groups like the FLA, whereby when France did come in 2013 in Mali to intervene against the insurgency at the time, there was some perceptions that they had favorable treatment towards the separatist groups in the north, that it limited the government's own entry into this region to assert state authority. And these have fed into some of the resentment that is seen in how these groups have either continued to be pushed out of national political processes or to underpin the view of how Janim and the FLA are operating.
Well, finally, Beverly, we mentioned at the beginning that you consult organizations on political risk. And you've been very busy over these last few days, of course, because the risk is very high when it comes to the events that have just unfolded in Mali, with no end in the foreseeable future. So what would it take for there to be an end for people in Mali, for the organizations that you work with who work there, for the friends that you have there, for them to get what they actually want most, which is a government that delivers real security and economic prosperity?
I mean, ultimately, it does hinge back on the government that is in place and whether they are willing to be able to either concede power and concede institutional control, which is one thing that this particular military government has not really been very open to. But another is also the kind of support that this government gets both from the regional and international community in order to then build its own capacity to govern in a way that is broadly acceptable. One of the things that we've been playing out is the scenarios of what's likely to happen in the coming days and how do people then adjust themselves to those scenarios. The worst case is obviously if we do have a real siege on the capital in Bamako, where people are not able to get supplies for periods of time, where there's periodic incidents between the militant groups and the army, and what risk this poses to people who might be just moving around trying to get, maybe it's their daily supplies for that moment, or maybe they're moving through a checkpoint, or they're trying to get to the airport to travel somewhere. These are risks that will remain. Another issue is whether businesses can continue to operate, because socioeconomic well-being is still important for stability. You need to have people engage in activities which then make their lives worthwhile. There's also the pragmatic thinking around what happens if there is a rupture in the government itself. One of the things that could be brewing in the background is a change in power, which then allows the Malian government to either negotiate with the groups that are behind the recent weekend of attacks and find a political mediation. But that's also very long term. When a group like Janim has so violently occupied various parts of the country, it's a bit of a bitter pill to swallow for you to say that it's okay, we can coexist side by side, especially if there's no clarity on how do we reconcile some of the things that you have done that may have harmed us or may have harmed the country's reputation and view in the world.
Beverly, thank you for walking us through all of that.
Thank you as well for having me.